In March 2000, the city of Irving, Texas, was rocked by one of the deadliest workplace shootings in the state's history. Robert Wayne Harris, a 28-year-old former car wash employee with a violent past, had just been fired when he returned the next morning with a gun. Within minutes, 5 innocent people were dead and another left clinging to life. This wasn't Harris's first brush with brutality. Just a year earlier, he had abducted and murdered Sandra Scott, a woman he suspected of stealing from him. Investigators would later uncover the full scope of his crimes, revealing a man consumed by anger, revenge, and cold-blooded violence. At trial, it took a Dallas jury only 11 minutes to convict Harris of capital murder. For more than a decade, his lawyers fought appeals, arguing low IQ, mental illness, and racial bias in jury selection, but court after court upheld the death sentence. On September 20th, 2012, Robert Wayne Harris was led into the death chamber at Huntsville Prison. His last words were not of apology or remorse, but of love to family and even a nod to his beloved Texas Rangers. At 6:43 p.m., he was pronounced dead by lethal injection. To understand how a troubled man spiraled from petty crime to mass murder, and how 5 families were left shattered in the wake of his rage, we have to go back to the beginning. But first, hit subscribe and tap the notification bell, because this is a story that doesn't just haunt Irving, it haunts all of Texas. Robert Wayne Harris was born on February 28, 1972, in Dallas County, Texas, into a life shaped by poverty, instability, and limited opportunities. His childhood was far from secure. Raised in an environment where money was scarce and guidance was inconsistent, Harris struggled to find any sense of stability. By his teenage years, he was already on the radar of local law enforcement, racking up arrests for burglary, theft, and evading arrest, small crimes that hinted at deeper issues beneath the surface. As he grew older, psychological evaluations painted a picture of a man with significant mental and emotional challenges. IQ tests placed him anywhere between 68 and 80, a range bordering on intellectual disability, while doctors noted symptoms of depression, antisocial personality disorder, and impulsivity that often push him toward violence. Those who studied his history later argued that Harris's world had been defined by cycles of crime, punishment, and untreated mental illness. But the clearest sign of where his path was heading came in 1999, when Harris abducted Sandra Scott, a woman he accused of stealing from him. Instead of turning to the law, Harris took justice into his own hands, holding her captive, killing her, and hiding her body in a secluded area. When police finally closed in, he led them to her remains, a chilling indication that the young man's criminal past had evolved into something far darker. By the end of the 1990s, Robert Wayne Harris was no longer just another troubled youth in Dallas. He was a man spiraling rapidly into the kind of violence that even seasoned Texas investigators would soon describe as shocking in its brutality. In March of 2000, Robert Wayne Harris's violent tendencies erupted in a way that would forever mark the city of Irving, Texas. Just days earlier, Harris had been employed at the Meaty Fine Car Wash, a local business where hardworking employees washed and detailed cars for their neighbors. But his behavior on the job was troubling enough that management had no choice but to let him go. Harris had been fired for exposing himself to a female coworker, an act that demonstrated both recklessness and a blatant disregard for others. But instead of moving on, Harris returned the very next morning before the business had even opened its doors, this time armed with a firearm and an apparent plan for vengeance. He confronted the employees inside, people who had come in early simply to start their shifts, and immediately asserted control by forcing assistant manager Augustin Villasenor at gunpoint to open the safe. What could have ended as a simple act of robbery escalated in seconds into a massacre. Harris, cold and detached, opened fire on the very people he had once worked alongside. Within minutes, 5 innocent workers were gunned down. Augustin Villasenor, the assistant manager who had complied with his demands, Rhoda Wheeler, a cashier who was simply at her post, Dennis Lee and Stan Joseph, both dedicated employees whose lives were abruptly cut short, and Jason Shields, another young worker with his future ahead of him. A 6th victim was also shot, critically wounded, but managed against all odds to escape the blood-soaked car wash and later testify against Harris, ensuring the truth of what happened that morning could never be denied. In less than 15 minutes, an ordinary workplace in suburban Texas was transformed into a scene of unimaginable carnage. 5 workers dead where they stood, and a survivor left haunted for life, all at the hands of a man driven by rage and cruelty. Robert Wayne Harris was arrested within days of the Meaty Fine Car Wash massacre, and when investigators brought him in, the case against him quickly grew stronger than anyone could have anticipated. Not only did Harris confess to opening fire on his former coworkers in cold blood, but during questioning he also admitted to another crime, the earlier abduction and murder of Sandra Scott in 1999, a killing that had troubled police but remained unsolved until Harris himself confirmed his involvement and even led authorities to the site where he had hidden her remains. With these confessions, prosecutors had more than enough to build a powerful case, and by September of 2000, Harris stood trial in Dallas County for capital murder in the deaths of assistant manager Augustin Villasenor and cashier Rhoda Wheeler, 2 of the 5 lives lost in the car wash attack. The proceedings were swift and devastating for the defense. The evidence, the testimony of the lone survivor, and Harris's own admissions left little doubt about his guilt, and after hearing the arguments, the jury took a mere 11 minutes to return a unanimous verdict of guilty, an almost unheard-of speed that underscored just how overwhelming the proof had been. Prosecutors emphasized that this was not a crime of passion or chaotic outburst, but a calculated act of revenge and greed, pointing to the way Harris had demanded access to the safe and then executed his coworkers to eliminate witnesses, actions that painted the murders as premeditated executions rather than random violence. In the penalty phase, the jury deliberated on whether Harris should spend the rest of his life behind bars or face death by lethal injection. And once again, the decision was clear. They concluded that Harris's actions displayed a continuing threat to society and that justice required the most severe punishment Texas law allowed. The sentence was death, and for Robert Wayne Harris, the road to the execution chamber had officially begun. After the jury handed down the death penalty, Robert Wayne Harris's case entered the long and often complex world of appeals, where defense attorneys fought to overturn his sentence by raising questions about his mental capacity, his trial, and even the fairness of the justice system itself. One of their central arguments was that Harris's intellectual limitations, with IQ tests at times placing him below 70, should have qualified him as intellectually disabled under the landmark 2002 Supreme Court decision in Atkins v. Virginia, which barred the execution of the mentally impaired. They claimed his low scores, coupled with a history of depression, impulsivity, and antisocial personality disorder, demonstrated that he lacked the mental faculties to be held fully accountable for his crimes at the ultimate level. But state-appointed experts disagreed, concluding that Harris did not meet the strict legal threshold for intellectual disability and emphasizing that he had demonstrated the ability to plan, execute, and conceal violent crimes, including the calculated robbery and killings at the car wash and his earlier murder of Sandra Scott. Beyond mental health, his attorneys argued that racial bias tainted the jury selection process, that prosecutors engaged in misconduct, and that Harris had been denied effective representation. But time and again, the courts rejected these claims, ruling that the trial had been conducted fairly and the sentence was appropriate. Over the course of more than a decade, Harris's case wound its way through state appeals courts, federal reviews, and finally petitions to the highest court in the nation. But in 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to intervene, closing the final legal door. Despite years of challenges, motions, and pleas, every court affirmed the same conclusion: that Robert Wayne Harris was guilty, his crimes were among the most heinous imaginable, and his death sentence would stand. For the families of the victims, justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. Robert Wayne Harris spent the last 12 years of his life confined to a small cell on Texas death row in Livingston, a place where time seemed to stand still and where every day carried the shadow of an eventual execution date. In those years, he lived under the rigid structure of prison life, cut off from the outside world except for visits from family, his attorneys, and the occasional chaplain. By September of 2012, after exhausting all legal appeals, his time had finally run out. On September 20th, Harris was transferred from death row to the Huntsville unit, the prison that houses Texas's execution chamber, a facility infamous for carrying out more executions than any other in the United States. Unlike some inmates who craft elaborate requests for a final meal, Harris had none, because just a year earlier, Texas had ended the long-standing tradition of honoring last meal requests after another inmate abused a privilege, meaning Harris was served the same standard fare as every other prisoner on the unit that day. That evening, shortly before 6 p.m., Harris was led into the small chamber, strapped to the gurney, and given the chance to speak his last words. Looking toward those who had come to witness, his voice carried a mix of affection and resignation as he said, "I want to tell y'all, know that I love you. Billy, I love you, English, Hart, and Eloise. Dwight, take care, Dwight. I'm going home. I'm going home. I'll be all right, don't worry. I love y'all. God bless, and the Texas Rangers, Texas Rangers." With that, the warden signaled for the execution to proceed, and the lethal drugs began to flow into Harris's veins. At 6:43 p.m., he was pronounced dead, ending the life of a man whose choices had caused unimaginable pain. For some, his execution represented justice, served at last for the 5 victims and their grieving families. For others, it stood as yet another chapter in the ongoing debate about capital punishment in America and whether the ultimate penalty delivers true closure or simply perpetuates the cycle of loss. The story of Robert Wayne Harris is ultimately a tragic reminder of wasted potential, of how a life shaped by instability, crime, and violence can spiral into acts of cruelty so senseless that they leave entire communities shaken. 5 innocent people, Augustin Villasenor, Rhoda Wheeler, Dennis Lee, Stan Joseph, and Jason Shields, were taken in an instant, their future stolen not because of who they were or anything they had done, but simply because they happened to be at work on the wrong morning, standing in the path of Harris's rage. Their families were left to carry scars that will never fully heal, scars etched into birthdays never celebrated, weddings never attended, and empty chairs at family gatherings that will remain empty forever. Harris's case forces us to grapple with difficult questions about how cycles of poverty and neglect can shape a person's path, about the nature of justice when weighed against such terrible crimes, and about whether capital punishment is a true solution or simply society's final act of retribution. For Robert Wayne Harris, the path ended on September 20th, 2012, strapped to a gurney in Huntsville's death chamber, where his last words were not apologies but farewells, and where the consequences of a life defined by violence finally caught up with him. For the families of the victims, the execution brought an official close to the legal chapter of the case, but not to their grief, which continues long after the headlines fade. If you found this documentary insightful, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe for more in-depth true crime investigations. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do executions like this bring closure and justice for the victims' families, or do they raise deeper, more complicated questions about the very nature of punishment and forgiveness?